The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Judge Vanessa Coleman took her seat at the bench. A 47-year-old black woman, she had spent decades building a reputation as a brilliant and unshakable force in the legal system. Her rulings were meticulous, her temperament measured, and her commitment to fairness and justice had earned her the respect of attorneys, jurors, and fellow judges alike. Today, she presided over one of the most high-profile cases of the year. The defendant, Officer Rachel Whitman, was a 39-year-old decorated police officer known for her no-nonsense attitude and aggressive policing style. Accused of excessive force during an arrest, Rachel's trial had drawn national attention, with both supporters and critics filling the gallery. As Judge Coleman adjusted her glasses and prepared to begin, the room fell silent. The air was thick with tension, a mix of curiosity, anxiety, and expectation. At the prosecution's table sat the state's attorney, ready to present damning evidence. Across from him, Rachel's defense team whispered among themselves, their client's expression unreadable. Judge Coleman's gaze swept over the room, taking in the eager journalists scribbling notes, the officers watching from the back row, and the family members clutching each other's hands. She had seen it all before. Defendants who thought they were untouchable, who believed their badges placed them above the law. But no one, no matter their uniform or title, was immune to justice. She struck the gavel against the wood, her voice calm but commanding. This court is now in session. The trial was well underway when Officer Rachel Whitman let her irritation slip. From the moment Judge Vanessa Coleman took the bench, Rachel's posture had been rigid, her jaw tight. She had been in court before, testifying, observing, but never as the defendant, and certainly never in front of a judge like Coleman. The case against her was serious. Body cam footage, witness testimonies, and forensic reports all pointed to misconduct. But Rachel, a veteran officer with nearly 15 years on the force, wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone she clearly believed didn't understand the weight of her job. That's when she muttered it, just loud enough to be heard. "Of course, a woman like you wouldn't understand the pressures of real police work." The words cut through the quiet hum of the courtroom like a knife. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The prosecution team stiffened. The jury exchanged glances. Even Rachel's own attorney shifted in his seat, his eyes darting toward his client as if willing her to take the words back. Judge Coleman, however, didn't react. She simply looked at Rachel, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched. Rachel held her gaze, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. Just for a second, barely noticeable. Then she rolled her shoulders back, as if doubling down. The tension in the room was thick now, the kind that made people lean forward in their seats. But Coleman wasn't going to be rattled. Without raising her voice, without breaking her steady composure, she spoke. "This court will proceed as planned. Officer Whitman, I expect you to conduct yourself with the respect this courtroom demands." Her tone was even, controlled, but there was an undeniable weight to it. Rachel smirked slightly as if unimpressed, but the mood in the room had shifted. It was subtle, a few jurors sitting up straighter, a couple of reporters scribbling more furiously. But it was there. The trial continued, but the unease lingered. And whether Rachel realized it or not, she had just made a very dangerous mistake. "Are you still here? If yes, comment, 'Not giving up,' so I can see you." As the trial progressed, Officer Rachel Whitman's behavior only grew worse. At first it was subtle, an eye roll here, a scoff there, small gestures meant to challenge Judge Vanessa Coleman's authority without outright defying her. But as the evidence against her stacked higher, so did her frustration. When the prosecution presented body cam footage of the arrest, Rachel crossed her arms and let out an exaggerated sigh. When a witness took the stand to describe what they had seen, she shook her head, whispering something under her breath. It was an unmistakable display of disdain, not just for the case, but for the entire process. Judge Coleman remained unfazed, but Rachel wasn't done. She began interrupting testimony, cutting off witnesses with sarcastic mutters, just loud enough to be heard. "Yeah, because they know what it's like out there," she scoffed as a civilian recounted the incident. Coleman's gaze flickered toward her. "Officer Whitman, you are to remain silent unless called upon. Do not interrupt these proceedings again." Rachel leaned back in her chair, smirking. Of course, Your Honor. Wouldn't want to disrupt this fair and balanced process. The sarcasm was unmistakable. A few jurors exchanged glances. Even some of the officers watching from the gallery shifted in their seats, a clear sign of discomfort. Still, Coleman didn't react. She wasn't going to let Whitman's provocations throw her off course. This was a tactic she'd seen before. Disrespect disguised as frustration, defiance masked as arrogance. And if Rachel thought she could intimidate her, she was mistaken. But the officer wasn't finished. As Coleman ruled on an objection, Rachel let out a sharp laugh. "Typical," she muttered, shaking her head. Judge Coleman set down her gavel, her expression unchanged. "Officer Whitman, if you disrupt these proceedings again, you will be held in contempt of court." For a moment, Rachel said nothing. Then she leaned forward slightly, resting her hands on the table. "Is that so?" A hush fell over the room. The air was thick with anticipation, as if everyone was holding their breath to see what would happen next. Rachel was pushing the line, testing how far she could go. But Coleman had spent her entire career holding that line firm. "That is so," the judge replied, her voice calm, measured, unshakable. "And I strongly suggest you recognize the consequences of your actions before you push any further." For the first time, Rachel's smirk faded just slightly. The message was clear. This courtroom had rules, and no badge, no rank, no amount of bravado would change that. The trial continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Everyone in the room could feel it. Rachel wasn't just fighting the charges anymore. She was fighting the law itself. And in a courtroom run by Judge Vanessa Coleman, that was a battle she wasn't going to win. The tension in the courtroom had been simmering for days. Officer Rachel Whitman had tested every boundary, pushing back against Judge Vanessa Coleman with eye rolls, sarcasm, and open defiance. But what happened next would change everything. It started with another ruling Rachel didn't like. A key objection overruled. A piece of damning evidence allowed. Her frustration had been boiling beneath the surface. But this time, she didn't hold back. She scoffed loudly, shaking her head. "Unbelievable!" Judge Coleman didn't react. She simply continued explaining her ruling. And then Rachel snapped. "Typical," she muttered, but this time she didn't stop there. She looked straight at Coleman and sneered. "An angry black woman who doesn't understand the complexities of real policing." The words rippled through the courtroom like a shockwave. A stunned silence followed. Even those who had been quietly siding with Rachel froze, their faces shifting from discomfort to disbelief. The prosecution's lead attorney's pen slipped from his hand. A juror covered her mouth, and several officers sitting in the gallery stiffened. Rachel sat back, arms crossed, looking almost pleased with herself. Judge Coleman remained still, her face unreadable, but her eyes, sharp, steady, took in everything. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for her response. And then she let the silence hang. 5 seconds. 10. Long enough for the weight of Rachel's words to settle. When Coleman finally spoke, her voice was even, deliberate. "Officer Whitman, your behavior is unacceptable. This is a courtroom, and such disrespect will not be tolerated." Rachel rolled her eyes, leaning back like she had nothing to fear. "If you continue to disrupt these proceedings," Coleman continued, "you will be held in contempt of court." This time, the warning wasn't just for Rachel. It was for everyone in that room. A statement of authority. A reminder that no one, not even a police officer, was above the law. Rachel's smirk remained, but the mood had shifted. The jurors, the attorneys, even the officers who had once seemed unsure, all of them saw it now. This wasn't just an attitude problem. It was arrogance, disrespect, entitlement, and the consequences were coming. By the next morning, Rachel's outburst had exploded online. Courtroom reporters had posted the clip within hours, and within minutes, it was everywhere. News outlets dissected every word. Social media was flooded with outrage, hashtags calling for her removal. Some defended her, claiming she was just a stressed officer pushed too far. But the overwhelming reaction was condemnation. Protests erupted outside the courthouse. Some people came to support Judge Coleman, praising her professionalism and composure. Others, though fewer in number, defended Rachel, claiming she was being unfairly targeted. Inside the courthouse, the walls were closing in on Rachel. The backlash wasn't just from the public, it was coming from inside the force. Officers who had once worked beside her were distancing themselves. The police union scrambled to defend her actions, but even they seemed to know this was different. Rachel still believed she could ride out the storm. But what she didn't realize, what she refused to accept, was that she had already lost. Because this wasn't just about one bad day in court. This was about accountability. And for the first time in her career, Rachel Whitman was about to face it. By the next morning, Rachel Whitman's outburst was everywhere. The clip of her sneering at Judge Vanessa Coleman, calling her an angry black woman, had spread like wildfire. It wasn't just the legal community talking. Cable news, social media, and talk shows were dissecting every word. The courtroom transcript was posted online, headlines blasted across every major outlet. Racist police officer disrespects black judge. Justice on trial. The moment that shook the courtroom. Accountability or cancel culture. The nation reacts to Officer Whitman's meltdown. The reaction was swift. Condemnation flooded social media. Legal analysts, civil rights activists, and former law enforcement officers weighed in. Some called for Rachel's immediate termination, while others used her comments as proof of racial bias in policing. But not everyone was against her. Her defenders argued she was simply frustrated, that she had dedicated years to law enforcement and was being unfairly vilified. Some tried to shift the conversation, questioning whether Judge Coleman had been biased against cops from the start. Others claimed Rachel was a victim of cancel culture, arguing that a single comment shouldn't ruin a career. Protests erupted outside the courthouse. On one side, demonstrators held signs in support of Judge Coleman, calling for respect and accountability in law enforcement. On the other, Rachel's supporters waved thin blue line flags, insisting that police officers were being unfairly targeted. Inside the courthouse, Judge Coleman refused to be distracted. She had seen cases spiral out of control before, seen how public opinion could warp the truth. But the facts hadn't changed. The law hadn't changed. And she wasn't going to let outside noise influence what happened in her courtroom. Meanwhile, Rachel felt the walls closing in. Her own department was turning on her. Fellow officers, once quiet, were now openly distancing themselves. Even those who had once backed her looked uneasy. The union scrambled to defend her, arguing she had been under immense pressure. But even they seemed to sense the tide was shifting. Rachel's career had been built on power, authority, and control. But in this moment, she had none of it. The courtroom, the media, the public, everyone was watching, and for the first time, she was the one on trial. Rachel Whitman returned to the courtroom, but this time, she wasn't just a defendant in her misconduct trial. She was facing contempt of court charges. The same seat where she once sat with arrogance and defiance now felt different, heavier. The weight of her actions, her words, and the fallout had finally caught up with her. The evidence against her was undeniable. The footage of her racist outburst had been replayed on every news station, dissected by legal analysts, and condemned by public officials. Witnesses inside the courtroom, jurors, attorneys, even fellow officers, had heard her words loud and clear. There was no denying what had happened. Rachel sat stone-faced as Judge Vanessa Coleman entered. Unlike Rachel, she hadn't changed. She was still composed, still in control, still the most powerful person in the room. But there was something different about the way the courtroom viewed her now. She wasn't just a judge anymore. She was a symbol. The prosecution wasted no time presenting its case. Rachel's behavior had undermined the court's authority, disrespected the judicial system, and set a dangerous precedent. If she wasn't held accountable, what kind of message would that send? Rachel's defense team struggled. They argued she had been under immense pressure, that her frustration had boiled over, that she hadn't meant it the way it sounded. But the argument fell flat. This wasn't a moment of stress-induced poor judgment. This was arrogance, entitlement, and a belief that the rules didn't apply to her. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocating. Even her colleagues in law enforcement, the ones who had once supported her, sat stiffly, avoiding her gaze. The thin blue line that she had relied on her whole career was nowhere to be found. Judge Coleman didn't rush. She listened carefully, weighed every argument, every piece of evidence, every statement. And when the time came, she looked straight at Rachel. "Officer Whitman," she said, her voice steady, "you have disrespected this court, violated its integrity, and displayed conduct unbecoming of a law enforcement officer. This is not simply about an emotional outburst. This is about accountability." The courtroom held its breath. "In light of your actions," Coleman continued, "I find you guilty of contempt of court." Rachel's jaw tightened, but she didn't speak. The ruling was harsh, but fair. Then came the final blow. "In addition to this," Coleman said, "I am ruling that you will be terminated from your position as a police officer. Your actions have demonstrated a disregard for the values law enforcement should uphold. There is no place for such behavior in this profession." The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, a few stunned whispers. Rachel's face went pale. She had expected a fine, maybe probation, but not this. Her career was over. As officers moved toward her, placing her in handcuffs, reality hit her like a freight train. For years, she had believed she was untouchable, that the system would protect her, that she would always walk away unscathed. Not this time. The courtroom erupted in applause as Rachel Whitman was escorted out. This wasn't just about her. This was about accountability, about respect, about the law applying to everyone, badge or not. And for the first time, justice had caught up to her. The final hearing was unlike anything the courtroom had seen before. The seats were packed. Reporters, legal experts, police officers, activists, and everyday citizens had all gathered, knowing this would be a moment that would be remembered for years. Rachel Whitman stood before Judge Vanessa Coleman, but she wasn't the same officer who had once walked into this courtroom full of confidence. The arrogance was gone. The defiance had faded. What remained was a woman who had spent her entire career believing she was untouchable, only to find out she wasn't. Judge Coleman's gaze was steady as she prepared to deliver her verdict. The weight of this case wasn't lost on her. This wasn't just about Rachel Whitman. This was about what came next. "Officer Whitman," she began, her voice unwavering, "you have disrespected this court, violated its integrity, and demonstrated conduct unbecoming of an officer of the law." Rachel stared ahead, her face unreadable, but her hands, clenched into fists, gave her away. "This is not just about your words," Coleman continued. "This is about your belief that your position placed you above the law. Your actions have made it clear that you are unfit to serve as a law enforcement officer." She paused, letting the silence settle, letting every word sink in. "As such, I am ruling that you will be terminated from your position immediately. Furthermore, in light of your actions, you will serve a sentence for contempt of court." A collective gasp filled the room. Rachel visibly stiffened. It was over. Her career, her reputation, her power, gone. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some were shocked by the severity of the ruling. Others, especially those who had long fought against police misconduct, nodded in approval. Rachel turned slightly as if looking for someone, anyone who still stood by her. But she was alone. Her fellow officers looked away. The union had stopped defending her. The same people who once stood behind her, protected her, made excuses for her behavior. They weren't here now. As the bailiff stepped forward, Rachel's expression finally cracked. A flicker of panic, of realization, of the weight of what had just happened. The officer who once wielded power so easily was now powerless. The courtroom erupted in applause. Judge Coleman sat back in her chair, watching as Rachel was escorted out in handcuffs. She had seen this moment before. Not this exact scene, but this same lesson. No one is above the law. Outside, the reaction was immediate. The case had been a national conversation for weeks, and now the verdict was sending a message loud and clear. Power does not equal immunity. Accountability is not optional, and justice will not be undermined. Rachel's fall from grace was swift and unforgiving. With her badge stripped away, she was no longer Officer Whitman, the hard-nosed cop with a reputation for being untouchable. She was just Rachel Whitman, the disgraced former officer who had learned too late that the rules applied to her too. Judge Vanessa Coleman had always been respected in the legal community, But after the Whitman trial, she became something more, a national figure in the fight for accountability and justice. Her decision to hold Rachel Whitman accountable, despite the intense scrutiny and pressure, was seen as a landmark moment. It wasn't just about one officer's misconduct, it was about the message it sent, that no one, regardless of their uniform or status, was above the law. The ruling resonated across the country. Legal scholars praised her firm yet fair handling of the case. Civil rights leaders called her a symbol of integrity in the justice system. Other judges, many of whom had remained silent in the face of police misconduct, began speaking out, citing Coleman's courage as a turning point. She was invited to speak at universities, legal conferences, and community forums, where she shared her perspective on justice, racial bias, and the responsibility of those in power. But for Judge Coleman, it was never about fame. She didn't do interviews for attention. She didn't care about television appearances or social media debates. She cared about the law, about fairness, about making sure the next generation of judges, lawyers, and officers understood the weight of their responsibility. She became a mentor. Young Black law students, aspiring judges, and public defenders sought her guidance. They saw in her what many had never seen before, a Black woman in a position of judicial power who never wavered, never backed down, and never let injustice slide. Inside the courtroom, her presence carried even more weight than before. Attorneys who once might have tried to undermine her now thought twice. Defendants who believed the system would always favor law enforcement knew they were getting a fair trial in her court. Her reputation grew, not just as a judge, but as a force for change. She pushed for judicial reforms, advocating for better oversight of law enforcement, stricter penalties for officers who abuse their power, and increased transparency in misconduct cases. Police reform groups reached out, eager to hear her perspective. Some officers, the ones who truly believed in justice, not just protecting their own, even welcomed her insights, admitting that accountability within law enforcement had been ignored for far too long. But for all the recognition, for all the praise, Coleman never lost sight of what mattered. She wasn't here to be a symbol. She was here to do the work, and she did. With every case she presided over, every ruling she delivered, every young attorney she mentored, she reinforced one simple, unwavering truth. Justice is not about power. Justice is about the truth. And no one, no matter how high their rank, how deep their connections, or how long they had worn a badge, was beyond it. Rachel Whitman had spent her career believing she was untouchable. For years, she wore her badge like armor, convinced that the rules applied to everyone but her. She had built a reputation as a tough, no-nonsense cop, someone who got the job done, even if it meant bending the rules. But now all of that was gone. Stripped of her badge, her power, her status, her identity, Rachel found herself facing a reality she had never prepared for. No job, no protection, no way out. She tried to fight it. After the trial, Rachel's first instinct was to push back, to blame Judge Coleman, the media, the so-called political agenda that had turned against her. She hired lawyers, threatened to appeal, even reached out to former allies in the department. But no one came to her rescue. The police union didn't fight for her reinstatement. Her former colleagues distanced themselves. Job offers never came. Her once loyal circle of friends, other officers who had laughed with her at the bar after long shifts, who had backed her up on the streets, stopped answering her calls. The reality hit her fast. She wasn't just out of a job. She was radioactive. And then came the real blow. Her name was blacklisted from every law enforcement agency in the country. She had thought she could start over in another department, another state. But no one wanted to hire the disgraced officer who had openly disrespected a judge on national television. Bills piled up. The severance pay ran out faster than she expected. She struggled to find work, but her reputation followed her everywhere. Even jobs outside of law enforcement, security, private investigation, consulting, turned her away. Employers recognized her name. They had seen the headlines. She applied for warehouse work, driving jobs, anything that would pay the bills. But the moment they ran a background check, the doors slammed shut. She was no longer Officer Rachel Whitman. She was just Rachel Whitman, the ex-cop who had lost everything. At first, she was angry. She blamed everyone but herself, the judge, the lawyers, the media, even the public for overreacting. But as the months passed, as her savings dwindled and her isolation grew unbearable, something shifted. For the first time in her life, Rachel had to sit with the consequences of her own actions, and it nearly broke her. She spent a year in therapy, forced to confront the very things she had spent her career denying: her biases, her entitlement, the way she had treated people, the suspects, the civilians, even her own colleagues, the way she had justified everything she had done because of her uniform, and the way it had all come crashing down. It was painful, brutal. But slowly she started to see what she had never wanted to admit. She had been wrong. She had let power blind her. She had ignored the voices of those who had tried to warn her. And when she had finally been forced to face the truth, she had fought it instead of learning from it. That realization changed everything. For the first time, Rachel stopped making excuses. She stopped trying to rebuild the life she had lost. Instead, she tried to make amends. She started speaking publicly, not as a former officer defending the system, but as someone who had seen its flaws firsthand. She spoke about accountability, about the dangers of unchecked power, about how easily a badge can turn into a shield against consequences until it doesn't. She met with police reform advocates, civil rights groups, and even former colleagues who had once despised her. She listened. For the first time in her life, she actually listened. Rachel was never reinstated as a cop. She knew she never would be. But she found a new path. She began teaching de-escalation techniques, working with departments willing to change, speaking to new recruits about the mistakes she had made so they wouldn't repeat them. It didn't erase what she had done. It didn't fix the years of damage her arrogance had caused. But it was a start, a long road to redemption. One she knew she would be walking for the rest of her life. The story of Rachel Whitman and Judge Vanessa Coleman became more than just a case. It became a reckoning. It was a lesson about power and accountability, arrogance and humility, justice and consequence. Two women, two vastly different paths. One had spent her life upholding the law, ensuring that justice wasn't just a word, but a principle that applied to everyone. No exceptions. The other had used her position to shield herself from it, convinced that her uniform gave her immunity, authority, control. And when the moment of truth came, the law held firm. Judge Coleman's decision wasn't about punishment. It was about responsibility. It was about sending a message that no one, no matter their rank, race, or career, could escape accountability. And that message resonated across the country. For weeks after the trial, legal experts, law enforcement leaders, and civil rights advocates debated what it all meant. Was this the start of real change? A moment of progress in the long fight for justice and police reform? Or was it just another headline, another viral case that would eventually fade, lost in the next scandal? Judge Coleman didn't concern herself with the noise. She went back to her courtroom, back to her cases, back to the work she had always done. Because for her, this wasn't about one trial or one officer. This was about the integrity of the justice system itself. Meanwhile, Rachel Whitman lived with the consequences of her choices. There were no shortcuts, no easy redemptions. The road back from disgrace was long and unforgiving. But she walked it anyway, knowing that she could no longer hide behind excuses. And in the years that followed, both women's legacies took shape. Judge Coleman's name became synonymous with fairness and unwavering judicial integrity. She continued to mentor young lawyers, push for systemic reforms, and fight for a legal system where justice was truly blind. Her courtroom became a symbol, not of power, but of principle. As for Rachel, her story became a warning and a lesson. She never fully escaped the stain of her past, but she used what remained of her voice to do something different, to educate, to advocate, to teach others the hard truth about power and responsibility. Their journeys were forever linked, not by friendship, not by respect, but by a moment that forced the nation to ask itself what justice really meant. And in the end, justice had answered. Justice isn't just about laws, it's about accountability. The case of Rachel Whitman and Judge Vanessa Coleman was a powerful reminder that no one is above the system they serve. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you think justice was served? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more thought-provoking content. Your voice matters. Help us keep these important conversations going. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.